afterwards, realized half the room couldn't hear me. It was the sound system, but you should check that before launching into a whole idea. So I just want to make sure everybody can partially hear me. I'll try to shout. Thank you for coming. This is a grant project funded by the Minnesota State Arts Board Legacy Foundation. The project is called the Creative Art, Grant for Individuals. It's an outgrowth of the old Artist Initiative grants, which were every 2 years. This one was kicked in by, because of COVID, they had canceled Artist Initiative, which I was in the middle of applying for, and then all of a sudden said, hey, you can get this grant, and it'll be a lot easier to get. So I jumped on it, and I had this idea in mind for a while, and I thought, well, I'll just use the grant to kind of put this together. I've got a lot of different layers I want to talk about real briefly, about my dad and why it's in this building, this show, and really what I got working on this series down this wall and some over here. From looking at my dad's work, I didn't try to show a lot of his pieces, but everything in here is here for a reason, so I'll try to talk about that a little bit. But just to give people an idea about my parents, and if you don't know the story, they came here in 1956. They met in college in the 50s and 40s. My mother, Bobby's here, and don't be surprised if she's correcting me.
Hey, you're a grandpa now. Congratulations.
That's coming. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is the number 28, and the reason is my daughter's 28, and she just gave birth to our first grandson on Wednesday in Cleveland, and I was there. I got back last night. My father was 28 when my parents moved here. 28 is significant for me too, because that's the year that I moved to Hong Kong, and it changed my career trajectory. So it's a significant number. We're not going to go into numerology here, but it's the amount of years that it takes Saturn to revolve around the sun. So, people are going to jump all over me for that, but I'm just stating a fact. But it does happen to be an important age, significant energy output, change in life. My parents came here roughly at the age of 28. They'd been in college together, met. My dad was drafted into the Korean War. They went to the South and were in the Army for 2 years. And then my dad went to graduate school on the GI Bill in Iowa, which was a very kind of East Coast looking art program, very, I would say, modern oriented, modernistic. And you can see this in my dad's work, but when they came to Northfield, it was to start my dad's career teaching at St. Olaf, which was to begin in the fall of 1956. He didn't have a job that summer, and they need to make some money, so he came to this building and applied to be a policeman. Because he'd been in the war, and he knew how to handle a handgun, and he'd been a guard, over a period of time down in his Army career. So he was a policeman, and he used to regale us boys with stories about being a cop in Northfield and how, you could drive through town, memorize all the license plates on the cars. That was one of their job requirements. He said, and he was not a big guy, just a little taller than me, but very slight, and he said, I could go into the municipal bar, which doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be behind the Muni liquor store. And it was a tough bar, but he said we'd go down there on Friday or Saturday night, break up fights. And I had this, he said, I had this buckshot-filled leather baton, and I would go into that room and I would snap it, and the room would go silent. And then they'd go pick people apart, and they would end up downstairs in the drunk tank. There's probably still a jail here in this building. This was City Hall, Police Department, all wrapped up into one. And in fact, we used to go, in the front of that window, the curved window, was the police dispatch. Had a big walkie-talkie microphone. You could hear the cops talking back and forth. But we would go in there to sign up for Little League Baseball. And I remember signing up with Sherwin-Williams Oil, which was the gas station right down below. It's now a Mexican place. It's very good, in fact. But Sherwin Oil was our gas station. Everybody had their own gas station. And they sponsored my baseball team. And I was literally just talking to Jim Strumset this morning. I hadn't seen him since we were in high school. And he said, "Oh, you had that wicked Mockestead fastball," which I hated. And I had signed up for that Little League team in the front office here. So this building has a lot of significance in town, but also, for a lot of people because of either interacting with the police or the city hall or whatever. My dad and many others in town ended up securing this building for the Arts Guild, and he's shown here many, many times. Often I've shown here with his work. In fact, the last time I was here with my show was 6 months after he died, and I had half the room of his most recent pieces and half of my most recent pieces. So it's becoming kind of a tradition. I would bet that it's the last show that I do with his work, but I feel like this is maybe the most important one. Really the way it evolved in my mind, the concept for this show came by chance. I had a studio in Marine on St. Croix, and I had found this piece in our barn. It was covered with pigeon litter. And so I took it and cleaned it up, and I just liked the way it felt as an object. I didn't want to frame it because I like the old tacks along here. And so I had it set up in my studio, and I had an open house of some sort. Somebody came in, and the person working my studio said, there's a woman here who wants the painting of the cliff. And I scratched my head and I said, I have no idea what piece that is. I grew up with this piece, and I always just thought it was an abstract painting of some object. So I went down and I looked at it, and sure enough, it's Palisade Head on Lake Superior. And I could see that now, but I didn't understand it until she told me that. And I had this piece for 50 years, And so I said, I can't sell it. It was done in 1955, before he even was out of grad school, but I'll copy it for you. And so I tried to copy this painting as closely as possible, and she has that. The things that I didn't understand in two versions of it was that the canvas surface has a lot to do with how this painting turned out. This is a very smooth surface, but I did try to replicate it in some fashion. What I tried to do with this painting was make it more realistic than this painting, so that if you were looking at it, you would say, okay, I understand it's a hillside, it's a reflection, some of it is maybe a little bit less abstract, but the whole idea of it got me thinking about doing this show. And so I started looking for pieces of his that I could put together that would represent sort of a cross-section of his earliest work. like from 1955 to 1970. So if you look at this big painting back here, that is probably one of the first landscapes from our valley, Valley Grove, which is south of town, looking from a bluff over into the valley expanse. And I was just talking to my mother, who said he took a lot of artistic license with that piece. And I can see that. It's not a literal rendition. So to some extent, it's an abstract approach to doing that landscape. And you see this thread running throughout his work. I wasn't necessarily interested in how to make my realist paintings look more abstract, although I did try that in each piece. This one, definitely not from the series, but these, I was working very heavily with the paint, trying to push it. Some paintings didn't work, so I just completely changed the idea. I wasn't working from a place necessarily, I was just trying to paint the painting. But then at some point I decided I want to make sure I get to the abstract part, which was the core of my grant writing project. It was to take abstract material from my dad's work and then create my own. So I used the blue painting in the back kind of as a basis for the abstract series that's kind of at the end of this room. And I took little pieces and just analyzed and studied them and blew them up. And so, you know, artists often talk about being informed by somebody's art or some piece. And I was definitely informed by his work. I wasn't trying to copy it. So there's a, I guess there's a process in most artists where they decide to replicate something, be it a landscape, someone else's style. What I try to do with my dad's work and try to understand was what was it that caused him to do that piece at that time, and then what changed it for him. And so there's really two different periods in this series of my dad's work. One is the early 1955 to 1965 period, which is really one of my favorite landscape periods. He's working directly from the landscape around Northfield. And then 14 years after we moved, you'll love this, Todd, to Northfield, we went to Holden Village, and that was in about 1969, 14 years later, and all of a sudden you see this explosion of real abstract curvilinear shapes. You see it in these drawings, Dole Lakes on the bottom, avalanche track at the top. At Holden Village, we were surrounded by mountains, and we did spend one whole year there in the winter, and we were just overwhelmed by the amount of material that was brought down the mountain into piles. And my dad was extremely interested in this too. And so he started making, and on that table back there, there's some loose drawings, making drawings of just shapes, interconnecting, and then those eventually informed his paintings. So there's one on this side of the partition. It's called Abstract. It's done in 1970, kind of at the end or the real beginning of the abstract, I will call it Holden period. The end of the Nerstrand period, the oil paintings of landscapes. And you can see a lot of examples of this mountain maelstrom, I'll call it, of shapes. Avalanche maelstrom. He would sit and draw and doodle and listen to jazz and just let his mind kind of free up and create. and then he would turn that into a full color painting. The painting on this side is interesting because, and you can walk around and see it afterwards, but I've never seen that painting until this show. I don't know if you saw it, but it was snatched up by one of his students, Christian Peltenberg Brezhnev. He's a Swiss, born in the Belgian Congo, an artist who came to St. Olaf basically as an exchange student. He really connected with my parents, and he wanted to buy this picture. My dad offered it to him for $250. And he was so poor that he had to go and work at Fairway Foods, and he packed Jell-O. And he said I would come home at night and my nose would be full of cherry Jell-O. But I knew I was going to get the painting, so it was worth it. And he's very successful now. He lives in New York. He's just finishing a show in Basel, Switzerland. And he said that the piece went from here to Switzerland. I was wrong in one of my emails. Went from here to Switzerland and to New York. And he was downsizing in New York, and he needed to donate it, so he gave it to St. Olaf College, and they were very kind to let me borrow it. There's 4 pieces here from St. Olaf in the show. The big landscape here, this abstract, and then the 2 winter pieces. And it started with 10 pieces that they had loaned me. I actually had them in the space here, but they were huge, and I just knew I couldn't use them all. So I just used the ones that I thought supported this concept the best. Sometimes I think about my dad's lack of ego when it came to his own work. He felt bad about charging a lot of money for his work. So just to put it in context, the $250, and I'm sorry if it's too much about money, and it's really not. $250 is worth $1,934 in today's dollars. That piece, just in a normal kind of Minneapolis gallery scale, should be worth about $5,000 today. So $250 was probably half of what he should have sold for, maybe a third. But his interest in doing the art was really to support his teaching career. And so people got a chance to see his work. It gave them a chance to produce their own work. And I'm constantly introduced to people who had my dad as a teacher, and talk about how important he was in their life, because he was very giving. And that's not to say he didn't cherish his private time. I mean, they bought a farm south of town, 7 miles, so that he wouldn't be interrupted by visitors all the time. And yet, every Saturday, there was a cavalcade coming up the driveway of people who wanted to see him. And he loved to see them. I mean, he never begrudged a visitor. Bart and Sue can attest to it. They bought a farm at the end of the valley so they could experience what he was experiencing. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. If you came from out of town and you drove here, you know how beautiful an area this is. I kept saying, turning left and right, going, oh, that's a landscape I paint. And it was very hard to just keep driving because you want to stop. But at some point you just have to turn that off. And I think for my dad, he would turn it off when he would go out to the Cascade Mountains or do these crazy bike rides across country. He climbed a lot with the Jacobals. Bob Jacobal, geologist at St. Olaf, retired, I think. Okay. And they both ended up climbing in the Cascade Mountains on what's called, one trip, famous trip is the Ptarmigan Traverse, and it's it's a serious classic ice climb. You know, you have to have the gear and the ropes, and so they ended up doing these hikes every summer. And sometimes my dad would propose a hike and he couldn't find anybody to do it, so he'd go and do it himself. And of course, no cell phones back then, and he never got in trouble. But we certainly worried about it. But that's where he would go to really recharge and come up with new subject matter. And you know, he filled sketchbooks full of pen and ink drawings, and he just let his mind go free. So part of my project here, you know, the part I'm doing is to figure out how I can go from doing realism to doing abstraction. And I told one of my painting friends, it's like I'm trying to break my arms. I don't want them to do what they're used to doing. And it's really difficult. So this was a chance for me to just say, hey, I'm going to do it. It's not a commercial gallery situation. I can do whatever I want. And so I worked through to about the painting of the airport on Park Point in Duluth. Just an exceptional view across the bay. These are both winter pieces, so it's a little bit unlikely, but you can see the sort of reflections in the ice. They look a little bit like water. I tried to make them as abstract as I could, although I still had to put some buildings in, you know, with some reflections. So I got done with those and I said, okay, this is nonsense. I wrote a grant to do abstract pieces, now I have to do it. And so I got all these canvases ready. I had the ideas in mind, and I sat down one weekend and I did all of them. And it was the most freeing thing I think I've done in years. And so I don't really know where it's going. I don't have to do anything more with it. You know, it is what it is. I got to see this painting for the first time, and I got to see that painting for the first time of my dad. So in a lot of ways, you know, the project is done. But I also went through a stack of old drawings in my parents' house in the studio in the basement, and I pulled this pile apart piece by piece and threw stuff away that didn't need to be kept. And I cleaned work, and I had some mounted and framed for this show. And they all have some significance in the series, going from an abstract drawing to an abstract painting. So I guess in that sense, the idea is complete in here. And I was so thankful that Northfield Arts Guild was open to doing this show. We started talking about it in the summer of 2019, and they agreed to allow me to do it. Heather Lawrence is here, and she was my main contact. And then during COVID, it just seemed very unimaginable that we would be able to have something like this. So we sort of put the show way out in the future. 2 years later, we committed to it. And obviously, we're still all wearing masks. Nobody thought this would last so long. But I am extremely thrilled that the Northfield Arts Guild is back after COVID and able to put on an event like this beyond my expectations. I don't think there's another place where I could have had this show and it would have made as much sense because of my parents' roots in Northfield and my roots here. So it's very meaningful to me, and to have all of you here. I hope you could hear me and understand what I was trying to say. I'd love to open it up for any questions. Otherwise, we can get up and look at the work. So I'm available for questions.
I have one comment.
Yeah.
So as a result of doing the abstract, did that give you a different way of doing your representational, or is it informing it? Did you learn something?
Yeah. So the question is, did I learn something about my current work through doing the abstracts, and I was literally thinking about that question on the way down here today, looking at, I was driving through fog, and there was a cornfield with rows cut, and I was thinking, now normally I would try to capture that fog, do the light, have the geometric shape, but in my mind I started taking out the palette knife and scraping across this area, and then merging this piece of paint. And so what I'm trying to do is think about painting in a different way structurally, in terms of application, and also just why I'm doing that painting. It's not just to stand out there and replicate it, it's to make a piece, an object like this, that maybe you could have for 40 years before you really knew what it was. And you learned what it was. And then you understood that they weren't just trying to fool you into thinking it's that place. You're actually trying to make an object that means something on its own. It's a very strange concept. But when I look at this, I see rabbit skin glue, which is the sizing or the surface that you painted on. How the oil paint relates to that surface differently than it does on a ready-made panel that I bought from Dick Blick. So I'm really interested in how you create a painting on a surface that is on its own very relevant, as opposed to just being a representation of a place. So yes, definitely, hopefully, I'll internalize something, not sure what.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the colors of one of your abstract paintings and also maybe one of your dad's? So your choices?
Yeah, so the question is relationship of the colors in a piece, and I would say, can you hand me this painting here? Yeah. Since it's going after the show, I can take it off the wall, heading to Milwaukee. So this piece was one of the last abstracts, and I took it from the blue painting back here. I could probably go over and point out kind of the area. I don't think it would necessarily be an exact representation of that area that I abstracted, but the concept of abstract mainly just means taking out of. So I took from that painting something, and I liked it because of the colors. A lot of people would say, oh, that's a copy of a Richard Diemenkorn. And he's one of my all-time favorite artists that I've looked at throughout my career, partially because of the color relationships. But it turns out that my dad was doing the same thing, and it was hiding in plain sight in our house. And so maybe I've been influenced by his work without even knowing it. So in this piece, I guess it capsulizes my color theory. There's a predominant cool tonality, but very limited use of warm tones to highlight the cool. And you always think about, in terms of color theory, the amount of each. It would be like, if I'm going to make chili, do I do 50% meat and 50% chili? That would kill me. And it would also not be very tasteful. Same with this, I want to highlight the cool blues with the warm tones and just suggest that in the piece. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Did you find yourself having almost a conversation with your dad as you went through recreating, pursuing your own abstract?
That's interesting, because did I have a conversation with my dad while I was working on this series? I feel like I've always had one. When he was alive, we talked a lot about art. Usually not the way you would think, we would talk about it almost indirectly. but we never went out and worked together. I never talked to him about my art career, but I think he knew that I was picking up a lot from him. But when I was working on this series, what I was really looking at was, if you go and stand close to that blue painting, there's a lot of interesting material going on. The way that he scraped the paint across the surface of the woven fabric. Some places you see that fabric, in other places it's covered over with a thicker layer. And I was really interested in that because I think for me, that's where painting really happens, is on the surface. And the more you can control that and use it to your advantage, the better. And one of the things that I appreciated about this piece was how you could have more transparent areas of blue than heavier areas. And those relationships talk to each other, and that's what he was doing in these paintings. That's so interesting to me. Well, I might be talked out, so let's wander around, look at it. Be happy to talk some more. Thank you.